Hey, everybody. Welcome to Other Side of Hurt podcast. Kayla is out of town this week, and I have tried to get a few other guests to come on the podcast to share their stories with you, but we just weren't able to make that happen this week. So I am sorry, but you are just stuck with me for today. But since it is just me, I thought a very appropriate topic would be talking about men who are going through grief and sorrow. Jill and I have been at Smile Again Grief Ministries for about 9 months now, working with families who have suffered the loss of a child. And the topic of men going through grief comes up pretty frequently. The fact is that men and women are different, and we often grieve differently. This can be difficult on families. It can be difficult on marriages. I've heard some women say things like, "My husband just doesn't say much. Like, I don't know what he's thinking. I don't know what he's feeling. I don't know how to connect with him in his sorrow." And that can be a problem for a couple in any situation, but it's a particular problem when you're going through major tragedy together. And if that's not bad enough, if you do a little looking on the internet, you're going to find certain statistics that are very scary. I have seen this statistic shared over and over again on different websites dealing with grief. And here's the statistic, quote, 80% of couples who lose a child end up in divorce, unquote. Isn't that terrible? Isn't that so scary? But I've got good news. The good news is it's not true. I don't know what it is about the internet that scary and inaccurate information gets shared like so much broadly than actual truth, but that's just the case of things, right? And so people share this statistic, and the reality is it's not true. Now, there's not a lot of studies out there on marriage and child loss, but the ones that I've found that are much more accurate have actually found that if a couple loses a child, their chances of divorce drop slightly. Now, again, that's a statistic. It's across broad lines, but isn't that so much better news? And the reality that I have found, and I think so many others have found, is this: when you are going through great loss, who is going to understand your grief and your sorrow more than the other parent of the child you have lost? Like, marriage and in your relationship with your spouse can be an incredibly helpful and healing thing in the middle of tragedy. But why is it that this false 80% divorce statistic gets circulated so much? I think it's because it kind of sounds true. It kind of rings true. See, I'm suspicious that if a marriage is already in trouble, if a couple already struggles to communicate, if a couple already has a lot of conflict, and then they go through this massive loss of a death of a child, it's almost certainly going to make things worse for their marriage. Like, things go from bad to really bad very quickly. And tragedy can be the gasoline that is just poured on a marriage that's already on fire. And so if you're in a struggling marriage, like, grief can be even worse. But today, I just want to share a few suggestions for men and women who are going through grief, but especially to think about the man's situation. By the way, I'm going to speak in pretty broad generalizations today. I hope that's not offensive to you. Like, I understand that stereotypes are not all true. I understand that generalizations are not all true. Not all men are the same. Not all women are the same. These things just tend to be true for a lot of families. So I hope you don't find that offensive. If you find generalizations offensive, you might want to skip the rest of the podcast. But these things tend to ring true in a lot of marriage, not every marriage. In fact, my wife and I are not stereotypically true in every situation. We have a lot of stereotypes that fit the male and the female, but one is clearly not true. And that is that, like, I am an incredibly emotionally intuitive person. I took a personality test a few years ago called the Big Five personality traits. And apparently this is like the most scientifically accurate of all those personality tests that are out there. And so I know psychologists and psychiatrists that, stand by the accuracy of this test. Anyway, I took this test and I scored by far the highest on the trait of agreeableness. Now, agreeableness means something like you love people, that you are kind and loving, that you tend to be very empathetic, you are pretty emotionally intuitive. And on average in this test, women score considerably higher than the average man. And I scored considerably higher than the average woman, which I'm not sure what that says about me. Like, hopefully that's not a statement about my manhood. I know my buddy Alan out there is probably shaking his head or nodding his head saying like, yes, it is, Tristan. But listen, not all of these things like ring true in every situation. I get that. People are not all the same. However, there are certain things that tend to ring true for men and tend to ring true for women. That's what we're going to talk about. So let me start. I want to say a word in defense of men and often their difficulty to know how to grieve. There are times not to grieve. Here's a generalization, right? Men typically are better at compartmentalizing than women. And some of the times compartmentalizing is necessary. I was just reading about the Battle of Somme in World War I. It's one of the bloodiest battles in the history of warfare. If you like read in, World War I, this is in France in trench warfare, which was just terrible, like miles and miles and miles and miles of trenches that are so close to the enemy. And the violence and brutality were unimaginable. There was between 300 and 400,000 men were killed in that battle alone. So you can just imagine the number of soldiers and just the chaos of what they were facing. And you think about like so many soldiers losing their best friends, their buddies, the men that they were in war with, and to see so much tragedy and so much loss. And it really wasn't the time for these guys to work through their emotions. Like they had to keep going. It wasn't an option to process their feelings at the time. I have friends in law enforcement. I have friends in the emergency medical profession. And when they get a call and they have to go into action, they have a job to do. In order to save lives, these men and women have to put aside their emotions and do the very difficult work that is before them. And you know what? We should honor that. The writer of Ecclesiastes in chapter 3, he says this: there is a time and purpose for everything under heaven. There's a time for war and a time for peace, a time to weep and a time to laugh. There's a time to mourn, a time to dance. I think what he's saying is like to be truly human, you need to respond in the right way at the right time. And there is a time for mourning, but it's not every time. There is a season to grieve, but it's not always possible. And I just want to say in defense of men who have not had the opportunity to grieve because they have had to push through for the sake of others, that is in fact commendable. On the battlefield, the first responder, the law enforcement officer, sometimes they have a job to do that takes courage, and they can't stop and deal with the sorrow in the moment. And that is hard and it is commendable. But here's the problem. Guys, what if you just go from one job to the next job to the next job? What if you bury yourself in work or in the task at hand and the season of grief never comes, even when you've experienced tragedy? What if we never let the battle come to an end because we don't really want to think about what we've just experienced? See, I think this is where the problem of men and grief enters in. Why is it that men so often respond this way? It's like we got to push through. We don't have time to process our emotions. We don't really want to think about the sorrow. I think in times gone by, there's definitely a mindset in men that like we have to be tough. Right? We can't let our guard down. We don't cry. We can't grieve. We've got to be tough. And this was probably more true 50 years ago in American culture than it is today, but I think it still exists. And some of the time we feel that pressure, right? Like we have to be the man. We have to be tough. We have to be strong. And some of the time that's what men are called to do. We're called to do hard things in difficult situations. I mean, honestly, again, this is commendable. If I am ever stuck in a burning building and the firefighter shows up, I would much rather him just courageously do his job and enter the building than to take 10 minutes to process his emotions about like his feelings about the fears of fire and all that stuff. It's like, no, just do the job, please. Like, be courageous. Like, we'll process this after the fact, right? But here's the challenge. Why is it that so many of us as men don't know how to grieve after the fire, after the battle, after the tragedy? I mean, it might be that like tough guy mentality, like men aren't supposed to cry. Maybe some of that still exists, but I think there's a deeper reason. I think there's a deeper reason that most of us don't enter in sorrow and grief. And here's what I believe it is. We just don't know how to. We literally don't know what to do in seasons of grief and tragedy. And we feel completely incompetent to know what to say and what to do. So we tend to avoid it. Here's a window into my own soul. As a man, I strive to be competent. I love doing things that I am good at, and I tend to run away from things that I'm not so good at. I often fear and avoid the things that I'm not very skilled at doing. When I was in high school, I loved basketball. I was a pretty good basketball player, but my biggest problem was this. I was pretty scrawny. I inherited the Borland chicken legs, which I still have to this day. But the rest of my frame, I was just really skinny and pretty weak. And the best thing that I could have done to become a much better basketball player would have been to hit the weight room every day. But I avoided it. Why? Because I knew I was skinny, and I knew I was kind of weak, and I knew I wouldn't be very good at lifting weights, and I was a little intimidated by the stronger guys, and I didn't want to enter into my weakness, so I just avoided the weight room altogether, and I ran more and I played more basketball, but it didn't really improve me like lifting weights would have helped me. See, what really would have been best for me to do, I avoided because I felt incompetent. And I think we do this all the time as men. Like if we're not good at something, we don't want to look foolish. So we go back to what we know. We immerse ourselves in things that we know and that we love, and we avoid doing the things that we aren't good at. So if you know and you love cars, if you know how to work on cars, you'll just go back to the garage, right? If you know and love sports, you'll go back to the golf course or back to the fantasy league. But who really knows how to do tragedy? Like we're all incompetent when it comes to grief. And by the way, what good does it do just to cry all the time? That doesn't feel good. I don't know what to say to my wife. I don't know what to say to my kids. I feel completely inadequate. I'm so confused. I don't know what to say. It's easier just to go back and do the things that I'm good at. Now, this might not be the case of every man in grief, but I think this is very common. So if your husband or your brother or your friend that you are engaging with in grief is avoiding you, I just want to say it might be that he's not actively trying to avoid you. It might just be that he doesn't know what to say. He doesn't know what to do. So I want to wrap up this video by just giving one encouragement for you guys out there. And then I also want to give a suggestion for all of the wives especially, but others who are walking with men in grief. So just two things. So first for guys. Guys, if you are facing tragedy and grief, especially if your wife or your family is, you have to push through your lack of control and your inadequacy and find some ways to enter into their grief, even if you don't feel like you know what you're doing. I get it. We all want to be competent, but there's really no way to do this well. So find a way to enter in, even if you suck at it and even if you're uncomfortable. See, we all want to be competent, and competence is attractive, But pride is ugly and it will always come back to bite us. So if your family is suffering and you're like, I don't know what to do, so you just push even harder into your work and you distract yourself even more with your hobbies because you're comfortable with those things. Like, I just want to say that is pride, my friend. And it's a bad long-term strategy. Like, you don't want to look weak. You don't want to have to humble yourself and enter in with your family. So you just keep immersing yourselves in things that you're good at. Humble yourself and enter in with your family the best that you can, even if you don't know what you're doing. It feels easier to immerse ourselves in work. I get it. I do. But you know what I know? Like, humility is beautiful and pride is ugly. You know this, guys, right? In your workplace, the guy who's always talking about himself, who acts like he's got it all together. I know this from, like, I was a pastor for 20 years. So if I go to a pastor's conference and there's this pastor who's like, I do all these great things, look at me. Like, I would just be like, whatever, man. Like, what are you trying to prove? You know who I like the most? The guy who's just normal, humble, just honest. Because here's the deal. Like, if we act like we've got to have it all together, like, we're not going to help anything. So here's a clue, guys. Just admit that you don't know what you're doing. Say to your wife, like, hey, honey, I don't know what to say to you. Like, I feel completely lost. Like, vulnerability is hard. It is uncomfortable, but it's good, especially in these situations. Humility and honesty actually take a ton of courage. So brothers, face your fears and courageously do your best to enter in whatever way you can. And I get it, you might not be good at it, but your family doesn't need you to get an A+ in grief. Like, they just need you to be present and getting a C, right? Just do your best and enter in. I'll tell you something from my own life. Like, I feel like I'm a pretty good dad. I'm a fairly competent father, all things considered. I'm at least not terrible at it anyway. But 3 days after our daughter Maria died, I remember being crushingly overwhelmed by my fear and my lack of control. Maria died when she was almost 4 years old. She died tragically and suddenly in our house. My wife was 9 months pregnant at the time with our 5th daughter. Our 2 older daughters just watched their sister die. And they were in the house with the ambulance and the police and the chaos and seeing their parents fall apart. And 3 days later, I was just a complete mess. I was freaking out. And here's what was going on in my head. I'm like, what do I do for my kids? Like, what do I do? Like, how do I navigate this? And so I went to my very dear friend, Lauren, and I went to him and I'm like, what do I do, man? I was like, how am I supposed to, like, what do I do for my kids? Do I need to get them in, like, counseling right away? Like, do they need therapy? Like, how do I make sense of this? Like, what do I do to help them? I don't know what I'm doing. And I was just so overwhelmed and I felt so hopeless and so panicky. And I was so lost, man. But Lauren, and I'll never forget this, Lauren said to me, he said, Tristan, you're going to be okay. He says, I don't know if your girls will need counseling or not. I don't know what they're going to need. But here's what I do know. You're going to pay attention and you'll figure it out. If they need therapy, you'll notice it and you'll get them therapy. You're not going to fix all of this right now, but you're just going to keep walking with them and you're going to keep paying attention and you're going to be okay. And I just remember this, like, 500-pound weight coming off my shoulders. Like, I was like, I have no idea what to do, but I can do that. So guys, you might not have any idea what to do in the middle of grief, but I just want to say this, just keep being present, keep paying attention, push through your incompetency and just keep showing up. Like, find 1 or 2 trusted brothers and be totally honest with them and be okay just, like, asking questions and being honest and not trying to fix everything and just be present. And by the way, this is totally an aside. If you have never seen the little 2-minute video called It's Not About the Nail, like, after that emotional little bit, this is like a moment of brevity. You got to watch this video. It is the funniest and most insightful thing for like all marriages. Like, so guys, after, feeling uncomfortable about watching me cry here, go click on this video. It is amazing. It will help your marriage. So I'll try to link it in the notes below this video, but it's awesome. It'll teach you everything you need to know about communicating within marriage. So, okay. Lastly, a practical word specifically for wives, but really for anyone walking with a man who is going through grief or very difficult times. Here's my word. Don't expect him to grieve the same way you do. Find a way to create some common space for the two of you that works for both of you. What I mean by this is to be creative and honest about how you guys can best engage together without putting too much pressure on yourselves. Here's an example. Maybe as a wife, what you really need to do is talk and process your emotions. Fair enough. But if your husband is having a hard time already knowing how to respond to you, then don't just go to him and say, we just need to talk more. Why? Because that puts just more pressure on him. It says to him, like, you're not talking enough. And even though you don't really know how to handle this, we need to talk more. And it raises the level of tension in these very difficult situations. It can also like raise the level of like, I don't even know what to say. Like, I don't know what the heck to say to you right now. And now she just wants me to talk more. And that just sounds terrible. Like, talking more sounds horrible. So here's a tip. Instead of doing that, creatively find a way just to spend time together. This is actually a tip for all marriages, but it's especially a tip for those going through grief. Here's an example. For Jill and I, when we lost Maria, the most practical thing we did was we just went for walks all the time together. Because if Jill were to say to me, Tristan, we just need to talk more, it would just be too much pressure. I mean, well, let's be honest. In our relationship, it would go the other way. Like, I'm the guy who can't stop talking. So we're the weird on non-stereotypical relationship. But the reality is, like, if one of us said to the other, we just need to talk more, it's like, that's pressure. So what we did is we found a way to create space. Let's go for a walk. I don't want to talk right now, but you know what? I can do that. I can walk. Because in walking, you're just together. And so, like, it might not be walking for you, but just creatively try to figure out what can we do consistently together that neither of us hate, that we both are okay with, that creates space for conversations to happen naturally. Like, relieve the pressure and increase the simplicity of just being together. Create the space. See, this is healthy, I think, for all marriages. Find things that neither of you hate that you can do side by side that create space. So, like, not watching TV or watching movies, because those things are too distracting. They're too disassociating. But do things like playing simple games or doing simple tasks together, going on simple walks, or finding little things like having coffee together, whatever it is, space to where there's no pressure that allows conversations to just naturally happen. Literally, Jill and I have walked hundreds and hundreds of miles since we lost Maria because we've just found like it's easy to do. I've actually learned to do this as a pastor because I'm a bit of a weirdo, but partly because I just kind of know how people operate. And so often if I need to connect with somebody, I don't say, we need to talk, especially to men. Because like if I go to a man and I'm like, we need to talk, and it's like, let's sit down and stare each other in the eyes. It's like, nobody wants that, right? Nobody wants to do that. But often with a friend, I'll say like, hey, let's go for a walk. And what I find is when we're walking, we'll talk about what really matters because it's not pressure. It creates space to be together, and it allows space for friendship to be developed. So if you're grieving, find these simple, agreed upon activities that consistently create space for connection to happen, and invite your husband to find something that he actually enjoys that you guys can do together. Maybe if you're watching this video, you can brainstorm after and just come up with a few ideas of things that you can do together every day, every week that creates space to be together. And hey, lastly, just be encouraged. This stuff is not easy. It takes time. It takes courage to press into the things that are hard. You're not going to navigate these things perfectly. Be patient with yourself. Be patient with your spouse. Let God's grace gently move you forward. He will be with you. Just go forward one step at a time. God bless. Hey, I just want to say thanks for watching our video. If you could, please subscribe to our channel. Like this video, maybe add a comment below. All those things help the algorithms with YouTube. We're just trying to get these videos out to more people who are going through difficult times. Thanks for joining us. We really appreciate it.